Racism, anti-Semitism, discrimination. These are topics which are not easy to discuss, and especially when you are a person who has a certain outreach in the social media community and the real world of free enterprise, then it often causes even more debates and discussions, and all these aspects often do not end very nicely. Today, we have an expert here, an expert about change, who did exactly that. He put a video out there about racism and discrimination. Hello and welcome, Ilja Grzeskowitz.
Hey, Niels, thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for taking the time, and we get straight into the topic. You put a video out there about racism and discrimination. First, as you know, I come from the LGBT community. When I see and I will put you in that category now. When I see a middle-aged, white, married, straight, cisgender man putting a video out there about that topic, I always think, oh my God, this is not going well, because 99 out of 100 videos start with phrases like, okay, I think we need to do something about that, and then but some people are just older, some people are from a different generation, we also have to let them talk, etc., etc. So what is your take, especially with the outreach you have, what is your take on the whole topic of discrimination and racism? Because the whole video is in German, so I'd like to discuss that here in English.
Yeah. First, thank you so much that you didn't say old white man. I appreciate that. Second, I'm not married, so maybe that makes me a little bit of a rebel. I don't know. Okay. But in my daily job as a keynote speaker, as a change consultant, especially in these changing times, I work with a lot of like teams, and of course the topic of diversity becomes more and more important each and every single year. And when you speak about diversity, you speak about leadership, and the general leadership, especially in, let's say, in Middle Western Europe, is still, let's say, a bit conservative. And what I often experience is that minorities, be it like different races, be it different ethnicities or whatever, are treated not in a way that is acceptable anymore. And very often it's very, very obvious. Like what we all know, every single day, racism is obvious. It's very, very omnipresent, but ever so often it's more in a subtle kind of way, in a way which people use their language and which people use certain phrases or whatever. And once we accept that, nothing will happen. And ever so often these people say, well, what's the problem? Why do they even care? And we said that 30 years ago and it was all right. And what I was experiencing over the last months and years, like when you don't do something about it, nothing will change at all. Nothing will change ever. And so I put this video out just to make a statement, because let's face it, every single person can do something about it, but only if we don't accept this kind of behavior, if we don't accept this kind of leadership style anymore. And the only way we can do something about it is, first, we start with ourselves, like we check our language. How do we use our language? And the second one is, when we experience any kind of racism, anti-Semitism, or discrimination, we need to say something. We need to say, stop. This is not acceptable anymore. We need to say, stop. Please mind your language. And maybe if this person isn't willing to change the way they behave, we need to make a cut and maybe decide, I'm not going to do business with you anymore. I'm not going to be on your team anymore, or whatever, but we have to do something about it.
Excellent statement. Of course, it didn't take long until people commented under your video. There are many positive comments, but of course there are, well, I don't want to say the people we had to expect when you put a video out there, but I just quote certain comments here where they say, for example, I don't find any evidence that, and then he mentions a certain word, the comment mentioned a certain word. I don't see any evidence that this word is actually racist. And then someone has, good luck with changing that. Maybe it changes in 200 years. And of course, this same person then commented, well, where does anything change except in the bubble of gender ideologists? How do you want to convince these people of anything? Because they are clearly not even listening.
Well, you can't. You really can't, because if a person isn't willing to even think about changing something, if a person isn't willing to change their perspective just for 1 second, how will you convince them? It's not my. I've never tried to convince people to change. You can only do two things. First, you can walk your talk. You can go first. You can lead by example, and this means like you don't use this kind of language. You change the way you communicate, and of course you point out when somebody's doing it wrong. So this is the most important step, going first. And the second one, it's kind of tough to argue with someone who isn't interested in facts and who isn't interested in looking up data or maybe even scientific papers about that, but only acts on an emotional gut feeling, or want to, like, they have their opinion and they want to be right about something. This never leads to something good. So I'm not trying to convince them. If I can change their behavior or their worldview with what I'm doing, I'm happy about it. But I'm clearly and really I'm seeing these people. Well, they won't be convinced by logic.
Yeah? Exactly. So when we say they won't be convinced by logic, and now we think of logical behavior, you could easily have said, you just don't talk about this topic. You're a well-booked keynote speaker. You just blend into the masses and then say, okay, they booked me for a certain change topic. They don't ask me about racism, anti-Semitism, or discrimination. So I just don't address the topic at all. Yep. Because when you address this topic, you also always have the risk that certain people will say, I will never do any business with Ilja, or I just stopped to follow him on YouTube, or just unsubscribe from every communication channel. What do you think about that?
Well, first and foremost, in my personal environment, in my family, my friends, I have so many people who are on the receiving end of this kind of racism and discrimination every single day. And I'm in a position, like you said in the beginning, I'm kind of privileged in the way I grew up and in the way I live my life today. And I could easily say, well, it's not my concern. It's not my problem. Let them deal with it. But because I'm so privileged and I know that, and I've experienced so many people growing up in other circumstances than I did, I think it's kind of like an obligation for me to do something about it. And of course, you said, yes, these kind of topics are controversial. And yes, I lost quite a few subscribers on my YouTube channel. And yes, there are probably some organizations, companies who are saying, well, with these kind of statements, we're never going to book him again, or this is not the kind of person we like to work with. Well, thank you so much for that, because as I said in the video, if you state something like this, like discrimination, racism is not tolerable at all, not a single inch for me, and people aren't agreeing with that, this is like not acceptable for me, then maybe it's the time, if you have these kind of persons in your personal environment, whether it's at work or in your daily life, maybe it's time to ask yourself, am I willing to be part of that team any longer? Or am I willing to do business with that person anymore? Or am I willing to be dealing with that kind of customer any longer? So for me, the answer is pretty obvious. No, I'm not. So I'd rather have a clear cut, because I know if we're working on a long-term basis, we will never be like happy. They won't be, I won't be. So it's better to be clear up front than to be sorry later on.
Absolutely. However, there are still many keynote speakers out there, and we both know people who said that, who will simply say, don't come up with controversial topics, don't talk about politics, religion, or anything which is debatable, because it could put off your potential bookers. What is your opinion on how controversial should a keynote speaker go? Where is the limit where you say that is unnecessary? Where would you draw the line?
Well, first, I think you can only make controversial statements if you have a good basis of your own values, and if you have an opinion on something. And let's be clear and honest. I know a lot of speakers out there who really don't have that, because they don't really. How do I phrase that? They
do everything for money is probably what you want to say.
Yes, let's say they chose to go the path of least resistance. In a positive way. And of course, there are some topics which you should avoid if possible on stage. And for me, this is politics, this is religion, and this is every kind of like topic which is not discussed on a logical basis, but on an emotional basis. But there are, of course, let's say there are as I said, politics and religion are, if you say something about that, there will be somebody in the audience who doesn't agree with you and who says, well, how can you say that? And these discussions are very often only done on an emotional basis. So I try to be as conscious as possible about that. But of course, there are some kind of statements which I'm willing to do, which is kind of like I'm clearly positioning myself whenever I can against racism, against discrimination, against anti-Semitism, because these are values in my life that are just not negotiable. And I'm willing to take a controversial discussion every single time, because this is what I stand for, and this is what I'm living with my brand. And so I'm willing to go down that road, but if possible, you should be pretty conscious about what you're saying, and you should be pretty conscious about the way you're addressing it, because there are so many pitfalls that are waiting for you in that road. So just my advice always would be only address something if it's really worth fighting for.
Mm-hmm. Excellent statement. So when now some people, just to round this interview up, when now someone is listening to you and thinks, maybe I should be a bit more clear about my values, but they are not really sure where to start and how to start. What are Ilja Grzeskowitz' top 3 tips of people who think change has to come now, but how to start? Your top 3 tips.
Well, first and foremost, awareness is probably the most important tip, because if you're not aware what you're doing, how you're doing it, and why you're doing it, it's pretty tough to change something. And with being aware of it, I mean, like really aware, asking yourself tough questions, asking yourself, how do I communicate? How is my leadership style? How is my daily behavior? What are my habits on a daily basis? And if you really know how you're living your life and how you're going about your job, then you can start the evaluation and say, well, is it bringing me forward to my goals, or is it kind of like limiting myself? And if you find yourself, there are some things in my daily life that are not the way I'd like them to be, then you can start changing them. So awareness is pretty much the foundation of everything. Tip number 2 would be to focus on one thing at a time. Don't start changing 20 things at once, because you will never be successful with that strategy. And the third one is try to stick with it on a daily basis. Like, don't do something one day every quarter for 7 hours, but rather do something for 5 minutes every single day. Of course, the more you do, the better, but do it on a daily basis, whether it's working on your leadership style, whether it's working on your communication, whether it's working on a skill you want to develop. Do something every single day until it becomes an unconscious habit, and then you can switch over to the next thing you want to change.
Excellent statement. Of course, I'm going to put your contact data in the show notes of this podcast so people can get in contact with you directly for further discussion, or what I would highly recommend, to book you as the keynote speaker for their event. Thank you very much for being here, Ilja. And as you know, there's always one phrase which I say at the end of every interview. Ilja, thank you very much for your time.
It was a pleasure.